there's an important story with this for Veterans for Peace. I'm actually going to recommend to Susan and others that we have a one give Jimmy Carter posthumous membership, uh, but also two create some type of Jimmy Carter award. You know,
Wow.
because I think we can get into all this, right? But the idea of like just like us, yeah, his presidency, when you start looking at it, you're like, holy shit, this is awful,
Yeah.
aspects of it. But then what did he do? And so a lot of us, that's how we were. A lot of us who uh, I took part in war three times,
Oh yeah.
right? I mean, like, how am I going to cast a stone at Jimmy Carter? I did essentially the same thing, So, yeah, but we can get into all that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's
Did
get
you
into
did you
all that.
watch any of the funeral service?
No, I did not. I
Uh-huh.
did not. How was
It
it?
was, I recommend watching it.
Yeah.
It was quite moving, and of course he had enough time to he and his family had enough time to really plan something that
Sure.
would
Yeah.
make meaning for him.
Yeah.
And, well, I think the most positive qualities of him came through in that,
Right.
and many of the eulogies were really pretty. None of them were phony, except maybe Biden. but, but what was so to me, Kathy watched my wife. She just had to watch it all, but I watched a lot of it. But what to me was so striking was how this, you couldn't get past this notion that this person was real.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't change based on the winds, you know.
Yeah.
What he did because he thought that was the right thing to do.
Right. Right.
And, and a lot of that I would disagree with. And much of it, foreign policy wise, was because he was getting his information from Brzezinski, who
Right. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
but
Um,
basically he was not like the and he suffered throughout the whole presidency that he was not from the lineage. He was not a son of the ruling class,
right.
and uh, and he brought with him, his view of the world that he got from being a peanut farmer in South Georgia.
Right. And I mean he was at the Naval Academy during the Second World War. I mean, all
Yeah,
of that, right? I mean, like that would have influenced who he was and his
yeah,
worldview and
yeah,
how he was willing to accept. And he was the governor from Georgia.
yeah.
So
Governor of
I think,
Georgia.
right. And his purpose was have we started?
Yeah,
Yeah,
we've started.
His purpose was to, I think, heal the nation after Vietnam and heal the nation after Watergate. And
yeah,
I think a lot of focus in the economy, of course, the conditions in the U.S., that was where his attention was. And
yeah,
I think maybe a lot like Barack Obama, he let go a lot of the foreign policy stuff. It wasn't going to be he was going to trust his advisors
mhm,
and follow their lead on this because this isn't my thing. What do I know? Kind of thing. I think I don't want to be as cynical about Carter as I am about Obama. Because so much of Obama's stuff was also geared toward domestic politics, but certainly that was something with Carter. But Carter, yeah, when you look at Carter's foreign policy, particularly knowing him. So I was born in 1973, just to provide the context.
huh,
So he was the first president I really knew in terms of being aware of. Like
Hmm.
I don't remember everyone talking about Gerald Ford, like I don't remember, but Carter I remember. And the first kind of memory for me of the world was the 1979 hostage crisis in
yeah,
Iran.
yep, yeah,
And so that kind of was one of the first things to inform my world understanding, my political understanding, my
yeah,
geopolitical understanding, right? Us versus them, all of that,
right,
And certain Carter's when you look back on though at his foreign policy, and it's even a mixed bag might be too kind,
yeah.
but
I
certainly I think
think,
it's worth something
yeah,
examining.
I think he was not. We were just talking about, the consistency of foreign policy from one administration to the next
Yeah,
is The only thing you can take from that is they're all working from the same playbook.
Yeah, I mean they're all have the
And they don't have the freedom to change the playbook.
yeah. I think I just said this the other day about I think it was Biden. I can't remember which, but if you were to replace the word president with emperor, would it make more sense? Right?
Yeah,
In terms of their foreign policy decisions.
yeah.
If you don't see Jimmy Carter or Barack Obama or Joe Biden or Donald Trump as the elected leader of the American people, but more as the emperor, the man responsible for overseeing an empire, some of the decisions may make more sense. Because we have this idea that the obligation is towards the public, or at least until their domestic political interests. And that's certainly true. I just said that about Barack Obama. It's certainly true. You look at Barack Obama when he comes into office, and Rahm Emanuel is telling him that drone strikes will make him a stronger president. And, certainly Karl Rove telling George W. Bush, wartime commanders in chief get reelected. I
Yeah.
guarantee you that's what David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel were saying to Obama in 2009 during the Afghan war decisions. As Obama kept troops in Afghan, I'll pick on Obama right now. As Obama kept troops in Afghanistan, that Emanuel and Axelrod were saying to the president, look, Mr. President, yeah, this war in Afghanistan is no good. But if you pull our troops out now and a bomb goes off in Times Square, you're not getting reelected.
Mhm.
I mean, so certainly there's all of that. But the obligations, I think George Kennan said this best in his memo to President Truman after the Second World War, where he said, look, the United States has, I'm going to paraphrase it here. I might be off of my numbers. It has 55% of the world's wealth, less than 5% of the world's population. The duty of every successive administration will be to maintain that inequality. Right? I mean, this is
Right.
the imperial obligation of the president.
Yeah.
Right? I
Yep.
mean, so I think when you look at that way, coupled with this idea that uh, uh, Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer, governor of Georgia, first priorities are Watergate, Vietnam, healing those things. He certainly right how he handled all that, but then as well too the economic distress of the country.
Oh,
It
yeah.
had to be his first priority, and so yeah, some of these other things you allow your advisors to tell you what to do. Zbigniew Brzezinski being his national security advisor, and I think a lot of people who are familiar with Zbigniew Brzezinski, although I will say in Zabrinski's favor, I had never seen this clip before, and I'll just kind of make an aside here. People haven't seen this. I don't know how long ago this was, during the probably 15 years ago. Brzezinski's on Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough and his daughter Mika Brzezinski,
Right.
and talking about Israel and Palestine. And it's a wonderful clip where Brzezinski tells Scarborough, he says something along the lines of like, your superficial knowledge of Israel and Palestine is embarrassing. So
Wow.
yeah, to Brzezinski's credit, but for the most part, I think people who look at Jimmy Carter, knowing him these last 40 some odd years post presidency as the great humanitarian he was,
Yeah.
to know that he pointed Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor, right? It's that dissonance that you're like, oh my God, but
Yeah.
it's complicated. It's not easy.
Yeah.
And I will say, I think certainly the courage, put this up front, right? The courage that Carter exhibited in his post presidency made up for, and it's a hard way to do it, but
Yeah.
I think was a deliberate atoning, was a way to reconcile what he had done as president.
He was criticized for the Camp David Accords
Right.
because he betrayed the Palestinians, but
And he was criticized by Americans at the time for even talking to Egypt, for
yeah,
betraying the Israelis.
yeah,
And yeah, certainly at that point with the Camp David Accords, he refused to meet with Palestinian leadership.
Yeah.
right? And Palestine was not a factor. And when Israel started, well, it was a factor, but when Israel started violating aspects of the accord, such as putting settlements in,
Yeah.
the Americans did nothing. Carter
Yeah.
didn't do anything
And
about it. In fact, he
yeah,
increased military assistance to the Israeli government. So yeah,
he was trying to get them together. And, you know, what we've seen with Israel is they have conditions on
yeah,
everything. And he was giving up, you know, conditions that he didn't choose to, but he felt like he couldn't get it done without conceding those positions. But he was made a lot of promises like no more settlements and everything else that they broke. But,
right.
you
And
know,
again, I think we have to look at his purposes and what he was trying to achieve there in Camp David. Certainly, the very public purpose of ending that, right, that hostility, that war, right, bringing the
yeah.
two sides together, big peacemaking. But it brings the Egyptians into the American camp, right?
Right.
It establishes Egypt
Cold
as an
War
American
stuff
ally.
too. Yeah,
Yeah.
they were talking about who's going to have the influence. Is it the USSR or is it
Right, right. And so you see that
the
again,
one
if you,
that should? But
yeah, we take a step back and okay, not President Carter, Emperor Carter.
yeah,
Wow, Camp David was really effective, right? He got the Egyptians. He got us to start giving the Egyptians. I forget when we actually start giving them the military aid. We do. We give the Egyptians more than $1 billion a year. But I mean, certainly the Egyptians become. It's if it's not right away, it is on the path towards becoming an American part of the American empire. And as you said, Harvey, making sure that they're not under the Soviet orbit. There are aspects people point to in Central and South America where he halted or he diminished support for certain regimes,
Mhm.
Chile, Nicaragua, I think Guatemala, a number of them on human rights records. But then on the other side of it, he was fully endorsing everything or fully supporting, say, what was happening in El Salvador. The think tank I used to belong to, Center for International Policy, was established in the late 70s
Mhm.
with the understanding of what the United States had done in Southeast Asia, but with the purpose of stopping that from happening again in Central America,
Right. Yeah.
which was the pathway that it was on. And so certainly you see the horrific crimes that we'll say on El Salvador exhibited against its people, but also against priests and nuns
Yep.
and the
Americans.
Americans exactly, and the continuation of American support. There's condemnations that come from Washington towards El Salvador, but the through line is
Those were Reagan.
continue.
I mean,
Yeah,
the real horrible stuff happened under Reagan, but
right. But
Carter
certainly you look at what occurs in the late
he laid
'70s
the
there.
groundwork for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I just did something else, and Oliver Stone was brought up. But if people, I had never seen it until a few years ago, and it's available. At least it was available on one of the streaming services. But Stone's film on El Salvador,
Yeah.
I think it's called Salvador, is a terrific, terrific film, particularly for people who aren't familiar with how atrocious it was, the scale of the of the war crimes that were being
Oh
committed
yeah.
with Americans, full American support,
Yeah.
and people
And with
familiar. Yeah, yeah. I
the
don't know.
oligarchy, the 14 families.
Mm.
Yeah. And
So
that
you
was Oliver
saw, yeah,
Stone's film. Oliver Stone,
yeah, it's, Salvador, right?
Salvador. I
Yeah,
think so.
I have not seen that, but
it's good. It's not uplifting,
no.
but and it's an early film of his, right? So it's going to be a little bit rough, but it is a very good film. But again, we get back to his Central American policies. So you could kind of give a 50. He was okay in some ways, not so great in other ways. And that's make oversimplifying it, particularly with, say, again, ending support for Somoza in Nicaragua, things like that, But then on the other side of it, where these really, and then we can go around the world, right, and look at whether it's in Asia, whether his policies, or even too, we could talk about the defense budget. I looked this up because I knew he had increased defense spending. I mean, one of the great things about not great, but one of the very effective things about Ronald Reagan's campaign about Jimmy Carter was that he was weak on defense, that he was weak
Yeah.
in foreign policy. He was letting the American, and certainly that's the mindset now. What did Jimmy Carter do in the military? Oh, he gutted it, et cetera. And the reality was the exact opposite. And so when Carter comes into office, his first year, 77, that would have been Ford's last budget. So 77, the Pentagon budget was $104 billion, right?
Wow.
By 81, so Carter's last budget, the budget was $176 billion.
Wow.
Right? I mean, that's a massive, massive escalation of the Pentagon budget under the Carter administration. And almost all the weapon systems that come to define the Reagan era, the Persian missile, the air-launched cruise missile, the MX missile, like the Peacekeeper, right? ICBM. Those are all programs that may have begun before Carter, but came into production during Carter, right? And so even when you look at like the big thing was Carter stop the B-1 bomber. And I can't remember if it was Carter or Congress that actually did that or not.
Carter. It was
Okay, so
Carter.
Carter stops the B. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Look, the reality was it's like, no, we don't need the B-1. It's superfluous. We're building
Yeah.
because at that point they were already building the B-2 or beginning to build the B-2.
Yeah.
It's going to be, and we've got the Pershing, we've got the MX, we've got the air-launched cruise missile. We don't need this B-1 bomber. So
Yeah,
it wasn't coming from a
Seattle,
dumbest
they were ready to
perspective.
hang him.
Yeah. Oh, they were. I mean, I remember as a kid, because I was always a nerd about this stuff. Big surprise, right? But I was always a nerd about this stuff. So I remember as a kid, like when they were bringing back the B-1 bomber, or was it 82 or 83, like hearing that word and hearing, blah, 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 Carter, like, so, but even to the other weapon systems on the conventional side, not strategic side, but the more, the Abrams tank, the Apache helicopter, all these weapon systems we still have now, which is a whole other show we could do on how poor and how bad and corrupt and inefficient and incompetent the American defense industry is that they haven't replaced these things yet, and regardless of how we view, right, the empire, regardless of how we view the military industrial complex, regardless of how we view our militarized foreign policy, our priorities in this country, everything else, I think objectively we can say having a tank that was designed back in the early 70s is just not a good thing, right? I mean, like you would have think at some point, 50 years later, we'd have a different tank, I mean, like, but the American military industrial complex is too corrupt and too incompetent to be able to do that. But point being, all these famous weapon systems that Reagan introduces supposedly to defeat the Soviet Union, right? So whether it's strategic or the conventional forces that are in the popular understanding, the reason why the Soviet Union increases its defense spending and that causes the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. They just can't keep up and they burn themselves out, basically, which is not true, but it's a popular understanding. And certainly if you get onto Twitter or something like that, this will be the conventional wisdom for the collapse, or one of the conventional wisdoms for the collapse of the Soviet Union was Reagan's defense buildup. We've all heard that before.
Right.
It wasn't Reagan's defense buildup. Carter. It was a Carter buildup that Reagan took right the glory of. Because again, Carter comes in 77, $104 billion to the Pentagon. When he leaves 81, the 81 budget's 176 billion. That's a massive increase. And so I think that shows a lot about the imperial nature of Carter's presidency. At the same time, too, the strategic arms limitation talks are occurring under Carter, right? Right. I mean, and that had a degree of success, but it also sets the stage to allow years later for the Reagan-Gorbachev talks. So I don't think if you had say, a Republican administration that refused to talk to the Soviet Union in the late 70s, let alone negotiate treaties, would it have even been possible 10 years later for Reagan-Gorbachev talks to occur, right? I don't know. I mean, because so many of these things are conditional on one another. And so, I mean, again, it's one of those aspects with the Carter presidency that certainly there's a lot to condemn, but when you look at it as well, too, okay, he also was doing this. So I'm not excusing the guy, but just trying to make sure we understand the complexity of it.
Well, the Carter doctrine, Matt.
Well, yeah. Talk about a legacy. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Well, Carter doctrine in regards to the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
establishing the Persian Gulf as an American national security strategic interest. And Carter actually creates what's called the Quick Reaction Force, which becomes Central Command. And the idea being this: the United States is not just saying that the Persian Gulf is a strategic interest of ours, we are going to act on it, that we are going to have troops present and prepare, as well as prepared to go to war there, and that we will by force ensure that the Persian Gulf is an American lake. And this, of course, is juxtaposed against what occurs with Iran. But the Carter Doctrine begins before the revolution in many ways in Iran. So this is when Iran is still an ally. It's this determination that this is going to be an American priority. This is going to be a national security emphasis for the United States, and we're going to put the forces there to make sure. And of course, everything that builds out from that. In around 2010 or so, Princeton University puts out a study, and it shows that from Carter's administration through maybe it was later than 2010, through the first administration of Barack Obama, the United States had spent $10 trillion just in the Persian Gulf region, policing the Persian Gulf region. Now, of course, that includes the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, et cetera. But just the emphasis put on that. And of course, you have from there the tragedies, the horrors of what that actually means. First and foremost is the Iran-Iraq War, which, there's a lot of controversy over what role the United States played in creating that war. Certainly later on, it's clear that the Iran-Iraq War was an American proxy war, that the United States favored Iraq and did everything it could to help Iraq in that war. But even if you go, within the region, certainly the Iranians, but many Arab countries, the understanding is that the Carter administration gave Iraq the thumbs up to do it. And there are American diplomats who say as well, Al Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, the most famous. He made this allegation, and then, but also too, someone like who I respect and I honestly believe, Ambassador Chaz Freeman has also said that he saw documentation that made it not that the United States gave a green light. Not that Brzezinski high-fived Saddam and was like, go for it, man. It was more of like there wasn't a red light, right? And again, setting conditions. So what occurs 10 years later in 1990 when April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, goes in and meets with the Iraqi leadership. I can't remember if she met directly with Saddam Hussein. I think she did. But, essentially the Iraqis say, we have these issues with Kuwait. We've gone through everything we can. We're, in diplomatic language, saying clearly, we're going to invade Kuwait. Like, in terms of diplomatic use, the language used by the Iraqis, it's clear we're invading Kuwait. If you're a diplomat, you don't understand what they're saying. Well, that makes you an American diplomat, probably. But Glaspie then says to Ambassador Glaspie then says to the Iraqis, the United States government takes no position on intra-Arab affairs, right? Which is, again, not giving them a green light, but she didn't give them a red light. And this is, I think, why that, again, if that's the case of what happens in 1980, and then with the hostage crisis going on, the loss of America's ally in Iran, right, and everything, of course, is colored in the fashion that Iran is now going to fall underneath the Soviet spear, which historically is absolutely laughable. That somehow the Russians and the Iranians will be allies. But American foreign policy has now made that a present day reality, right? But exactly. Which is amazing. It's incredible. But the not giving a red light to the Iraqis, then, if that's what occurred, this awful, horrible Iran-Iraq war, 1 million dead, sucks the United States. It's already there through the QRF, which became the Central Command, right? The Carter Doctrine, and now the United States is engaged in combat at times in Iraq. And people remember in the 80s the tanker wars, where the United States reflags all the tankers going through the Gulf, and then we lost American sailors there. We shot down a civilian airliner. Up until this past year with the battles in the Red Sea against the Yemenis. the in 1987, I think it was, or 88, the American Navy fights its largest battle at sea against the Iranians since the Second World War. It's been surpassed now by what's occurring in the Red Sea. Something the United States Navy was really happy to triumph, by the way, a year ago as it started. And a couple months later, this is the greatest naval expedition, greatest naval battle for the American Navy since World War II. They don't say that so much anymore because it's a defeat, right?
Yeah.
It's essentially the Yemenis still are maintaining control of the Red Sea to a degree where at least half of the traffic that would normally transit the Red Sea no longer does. And the Israeli port in Eilat, their southern port on the Red Sea, next to Aqaba, that went bankrupt 6 months ago, 8 months ago. I mean, so, I mean, again, the Carter Doctrine, it sets a lot of this in motion, right? It provides the structure, it provides the presence of the American troops, the policy commitments, but then it also, too, which is so important, it sets the mindset for Washington, D.C. and the establishment, where everything is geared towards the Persian Gulf. This, of course, comes to fruition with the George W. Bush administration, right? But you certainly see that as well, of course, George H.W. Bush throughout the Barack Obama administration. It's first and foremost for the Trump administration. Biden's legacy, of course, is the genocide in Palestine and Gaza. But, I mean, what the Carter Doctrine does, and the fact that the Iranian hostage crisis is tied into that, it establishes a mindset that dominates American foreign policy thinking until now. So going on 46 years, 47 years, you have an understanding in Washington, D.C., among the foreign policy elite, the blob, that if we were to go there, guys, to D.C. and go to these think tanks and going to the congressional committees and walk to the Pentagon and go over to Langley and Foggy Bottom and meet with the NSC, okay, who's the top adversaries? Who are the top enemies for the United States? Instead, we had a time machine. We were able to do it like over the last 40 some odd years. Iran would often be number one. And it would always be in the top three. Sometimes it might be Iraq. Sometimes it might be Russia, China, Venezuela, Panama, whoever, right? I mean, but Iran would always has always been in that top three villains list. That isn't just like the common American understanding, because that then transcends down. Because I think if we were to go back and look at the public opinion polling that said, like Gallup or Pew does, that who's the biggest threat in the world? Yeah, Iran is not number one all the time. Sometimes they are, but they're always going to be in that top three. And so again, this is a legacy of Jimmy Carter.
And that's top three since the Ayatollah overthrew the Shah,
Right.
since the
Right.
Shah was, because it was our Shah.
It was, and there's the relationship between Carter and the Shah was strong. I can't remember exactly. I can't remember how far before he was overthrown. Not very far. Carter he goes and gives big toast and everything, and the health of the American government's assessment is that the Shah's position is strong and it's healthy and everything. And yeah.
And there he goes.
Yeah.
And then after he's overthrown, we invite him here for his medical treatment.
Well, yeah, it is. That's a huge part of that, right? Is the anger
Yeah.
that right? The anger that rather than sending him back to be held accountable for his crimes, or even be kind of held in exile or abstention, and I think he had gone to Italy, if I remember right. It's kind of there. The Americans welcome him back for and they're going to take care of him. And that anger among the Iranian people, it explodes. And of
And
course,
this was when we already knew that the American embassy staff was there. They were vulnerable. And as soon as that happened, they were hostages.
yeah, and it's I think like in a lot of other cases too, it didn't have to be that way,
Right.
right? But I think the fear of the Soviet Union that drives so much, and the Soviets were the same way with us. you know. So when the, I mean, this has other repercussions. I mean, it's how everything is linked, right? You know, all the stories, it's all linked together. You know, so the Soviet Union, when Iran falls and no longer an American ally, no longer American bases, particularly the intelligence bases that could eavesdrop into the Soviet Union. That was a big thing. And if you go back and you look at in 79, the debates within the Politburo, right, at the Kremlin over Afghanistan. And we haven't even gotten to Afghanistan, the Carter and Brzezinski's role in that. But they're saying, look, the Americans have just lost Iran. They need someplace else to go. They're going to go into Afghanistan. Now, I have never seen anything. I've never heard anyone, not even the most looniest, you know, ever say that the United States was going to invade Afghanistan and put bases in there in 1980 because of losing Iran. But that's what the Soviets believed. That's what was being spoken at the Politburo. That's what they were saying. They believe this because it's the same thing. They're human too. They have the same mindsets, the same fears. They have the same narrative constructions, the same biases, the same chauvinism, the same propaganda to influence them. And they saw the Americans hiding behind every door, just like we saw a Soviet underneath every bed. Right, you know, I mean, so you know, you saw that even, and so that's one of several reasons why the Soviets invade in December of 1979 is they're afraid that if we don't go into Afghanistan, the Americans will. Right. So, but you know, with the Iranians, there is a possibility there of an understanding of the Iranian, even after the Islamists, the Ayatollahs crowd, even after they consolidate and it's clear they're maintaining, they're gonna have power because the Iranian Revolution was widespread. I mean, everyone was involved in it. Everyone hated the Shah. You know, I mean, so like everyone's, you know, I mean, so and that's, you know, but when the Ayatollahs crowd consolidates their power and they are the victors. You know, there's opportunity there. There's opportunity for the Americans to have established a relationship with the Iranians that would have not resulted in the last 40 some odd years. Essentially, let the Iranians be, leave them alone. You know, acknowledge what you did, say I'm sorry for supporting the Shah, and then let us be, and we'll sell you oil and gas. You'll sell us spare parts for our planes and stuff like that, and our relationship will continue to go on. That could have happened. And where did we hear that before, right? We heard that with the Vietnamese, right? Certainly, right? I mean, we've heard that before. Cuba, Castro was not in the Soviet camp until the Americans had firmly rejected him. And it's this idea, it's an imperial mindset. For Vietnam, of course, it was the assumption of the French Empire into the American Empire, right? So this is why the Americans had that role in Southeast Asia. And so their interests became our interests, whether it actually mattered or not, didn't matter. Just there are now our interests. At Cuba, it was because you took out our guy Batista. And we're really on, and it's an affront to us. And the same in Iran, the effrontery, the offense, the impudence of you know doing this. You know, if go back in time, imagine back in time, and the emperor has an affront like this, right? What would occur, right? I just had this conversation exactly say with Julian Assange. Why was the American empire so vicious? Why did they hate Julian? Why did they hate Chelsea Manning so much? Because of the affront, the offense.
And he's
Right?
setting a precedent.
He said it was setting a precedent as well too. If he
That's
gets
what
away with
Cuba
it,
did.
oh
Yeah.
my God, right? So
If they can get away with it, who's next?
Right. And so what would the empire in olden times do? What would the emperor say in olden times, right? Off with their head, you know, kind of thing, right? You know what I mean? So yeah, it's the same construct. It's the same characters. And Carter was not immune to that. And Carter had taken on this title. He was coronated as the emperor. You know, we never used that language. It's never understood that way. But, you know, and certainly the idea of the American empire, you know, I wasn't around in 77, 78, 79. I don't know how that type of terminology would have been accepted. You know, maybe more because it was such a bipolar U.S. versus Soviet, you know, and maybe it's spheres of influence and things like that. But certainly, military empire is the right way to describe it, and it remains so. You know, there's Mike, his name's Michael Mann. He wrote many years, 20, at least, I'm not even certain, but he wrote about empire. He described an empire of having four lines or four functions, and that's how you determine if something's an empire. One is military. Look at the map of American military bases around the world. Okay, clear. The second is economic. I think the understanding, again, go back to what Kennan says, right? We have 55% of the world's wealth, and it's our job to keep it, right? And let alone all the other aspects.
And we've got a third of the planet under sanctions.
Right, yeah, all of that, right? I mean, and just yeah, even look at, and this blends into the third one, the political, in terms of what institutions are available. Look at 1944, Bretton Woods, right? And the
Yep.
creation of the modern world economic system, which of course there's now revulsion to, and there's friction, there's fractures, and you're seeing, right? But what you have there is the establishment of an economic world order to ensure the primacy of the United States, to ensure American economic hegemony. And then you have institutions created like the IMF or the World Bank, right? I mean, then you get into the political aspects. That's also blends into the political aspects of empire. And the fourth one, and this is what Mann says is the most important, is the ideological, right? Is the religious, is the theology of empire, as is described by another author, Mark Crossan, who wrote a great book called God and Empire. Particularly folks who are religious or interested in religion, understanding that structure there between religion and empire. But the theology of empire, right? And so certainly you could talk about information and propaganda and media and everything, and Hollywood, right? Hollywood itself, a huge aspect of the American empire, right? But just with the theology aspect of it, leader of the free world, right? That says it all there, right? I mean, that's an imperial structure in itself. And, getting back to Carter, that certainly was an aspect of the Carter administration, their role as the leader of the free world in terms of that conflict with the Soviets, but also to maintaining the empire that he inherited, his obligation as the president or as the empire to do so. I would say, just quick, because we should talk about Afghanistan. Afghanistan was very complex in the 70s. For 40 some odd years, it was ruled by King Zahir Shah. The king ruled to 73. And sorry, my dog made me lose my concentration there. The king ruled to 73. And he's overthrown by a socialist, his cousin or his nephew or whoever Daoud was. And then it becomes a great game in Afghanistan. And Daoud, the prime minister, at one point says, "I light my American cigarettes with Soviet lighters," right? And hey, Daoud, how well did that work out for you? You were gone by 77, I think. And so, but
A
anyway,
lot of help from the Mujahideen and
yeah, so that's what happens. You start Afghanistan.
Carter again.
Yeah, Afghanistan becomes a great game, becomes this battleground for American and Soviet interests. And of course, Indian and Pakistani interests are overlapping as well. There's Iranian interests in there, right? It's a crossroads. It's kind of like what you see with Syria. Right now, you look at Syria, and you've got Iranian, Qatari, Israeli, American, Russian, Turkish, of course, right? I'm probably forgetting other interests. And why? Because Syria is a crossroads where it's located, the overlapping of interests there. Afghanistan was the same. And what you get to the point, though, is it becomes, for whatever reason, Afghanistan, the poorest country in the world, probably, least developed. It is, I mean, it is very, very bad there. This is a priority for both the Soviets and the Americans to possess this piece of land. And this is not new to Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan, this is going back to the 19th century. This is 4 British invasions. And why did the British invade Afghanistan all those times? Why did they come out of India into Afghanistan? Most of the time, getting their butt kicked pretty badly most times, was because they are afraid that the Russians, Imperial Russia, Tsarist Russia, was going to invade India through Afghanistan. So we need to put British troops into Afghanistan to protect India. Now, as a side, when the Soviet Union fell, and historians were able to get into all the archives and everything else, you know how many documents they found pertaining to Russia invading India via Afghanistan? Zero, exactly, right? I mean, so again, it's this type of mindset of where you're so blinkered, you're so controlled by your narrative, and in the eyes, an imperial narrative, British at that time too, an imperial narrative, that nothing else matters. And so you have this game develop, and the United States actually starts funding really terrible people in the early 70s. So this goes back to Nixon and Kissinger. They start funding some of the most reactionary religious movements in Afghanistan, including Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, famous at that point in the 70s for throwing acid in the face of women who were unveiled. And this rolls and rolls and rolls, and then you have, of course, an Afghan government that is a socialist government, then a communist government, but progressive. And the splits that you'd see in any society between the urban and the rural, the traditional and the progressive, the conservative and the whatever you want to define that, right, are clear. And the United States sides with that reactionary rather than radical side as the Soviets do. And by 79, Afghanistan is a focal point for American as well as Soviet foreign policy. And again, you look at it and you say, why? But this is the mindset, the megalomania brought it there, right? And then what you get is by 79, you've got Zygmunt Brzezinski, who's a Pole and who has an absolute hatred, and Brzezinski, again, is Carter's national security advisor, absolute hatred of the Soviet Union. Whereas Ronald Reagan described the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and one of his speechwriters put that in there, and whether Reagan actually believed that or not, who knows. Brzezinski really did believe the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And so this idea being, if you remember, what also is taking place, not just in Iran, but in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia in the late 70s, are these really are these Islamic uprisings that are incredibly scary to established governments. Both the Saudis and the Pakistanis face existential threats from these movements, right? And so the idea that Brzezinski has, and others, including like Robert Gates, who at that time was the head of the Soviet Union, of the CIA desk for the Soviet Union. Gates later became director CIA, became Secretary of Defense. He's a real good friend of our friend and colleague Ray McGovern. Anyone who knows what I'm talking about knows that that's not the case at all. But Ray also was on the Soviet desk. But this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to use Afghanistan to set a trap. We're going to bait a trap for the Soviets, and we're going to start arming these reactionary, religious, rural, traditional, conservative groups that are against what's happening with the communist government in Afghanistan. So the idea being is that we are going to light a fire, and the Soviet Union is going to have to come into Afghanistan to put that fire out. The idea that Brzezinski had was we are going to blow Afghanistan up, and we're going to export Islamic revolution into the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. And if people remember, the Soviet Union, their republics in the southern part of Central Soviet Union were Muslim. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. And so the idea was we're going to ignite Islamic revolution in Afghanistan. The Reagan administration takes that a step further by, of course, bringing over the Arab fighters, which then some of them became Al Qaeda, right? So of course all this blowback, but the idea is that we're going to give, in Brzezinski's words, the Soviet Union their own Vietnam, and in many ways it was successful, right? The Soviet Union, the United States starts funding the Mujahideen in around June of 1979, and the Soviet Union invades in December of 79. At that point, by the time the Soviet Union invades, 100,000 Afghans have been killed in fighting over the last 3 or 4 years. So it was a very violent, ugly situation in Afghanistan. And when I was there in Afghanistan, it really came down to these lines, these splits in the society. And I met a man who was very proud of the fact that his province was the second province to revolt from the government. And when I said, well, why'd you guys revolt? And I believe he was from Badakhshan, which is in the far northeast. Why'd you guys revolt? He said, because the government came to our town or came to our village and asked us what our wives' names are. You know, that
Oh
was the
boy.
type of split that was there, that split between the progress and tradition, you know.
Yeah.
The United States tried to exploit that. And again, the legacy, how this all carries on. Why was Carter important? Well, because, look at Afghanistan now. Look at the reality for the Afghan people. I mean, for 50, so I was born in 73, the same year that the king was removed in Afghanistan. If I was an Afghan man, my whole life would have been just war or at best political chaos. And now, of course, life under the Taliban. God help those people. You can say the same for Iraq. 73, I believe, is when Nixon and Kissinger start arming the Kurds. The U.S. may have started that before, but as far as I'm aware, that's when they really start arming the Kurds to use against the Baghdad government. And 78 or so is when the coup occurs in Iraq. And that's when the United States says, well, Kurds, we don't need you any longer. We're going to, we didn't reestablish relations with Iraq right away, but we're heading there. We don't need the Kurds. So it's under the Carter administration, you see one of the first of, not maybe not the first, but one of many betrayals of the Kurds for geopolitical interests, right? For clear imperial interests. If we're friends, we're either going to use these people against the countries that are not the same color on the map as we are, or we're going to help those countries that are the same color on the map suppress those kinds of people.
So do you think Jimmy Carter was a victim of empire?
I think, I want to be charitable, Jim, because I do. I want to be charitable. I mean, most of my adult life, most of my life, I've known Carter post-president. He's out there swinging his hammer, right? Building homes through Habitat for Humanity, right? The great courage, I'm sure we'll get to this, right? The great courage he displays in, what was it, 2007, when he publishes his book, Peace, Not Apartheid, right, on Palestine. That courage he had, certainly, I think his role in that humanitarian work, or in that world to like counter the American empire's narrative. Yeah, it shows someone that I think is very important. We talked about this earlier on. I can't remember if you're recording or not, but it gets to the heart of Veterans for Peace. And this is why I'd like to see, Veterans for Peace posthumously make Jimmy Carter a member. I don't think he's a member, but make him a member, as well as maybe give him an award. Because here's a man who turned from what he had done, right? Here's a man who had the guts to say Israel is an apartheid state before very, very, very few others, almost no one in the United States who had the significance or the meaning of Jimmy Carter were saying that type of thing, right? So as well as so I think that type of understanding what he had done and then turning away from it and making amends to a degree is important, and it's an important story. And I think it's the most important story, because if it wasn't Carter, it would have been somebody else, right? If it wasn't Carter, it would have been someone else. Certainly.
Really, and what he was trying to do was raise the consciousness and the conscience of the American people to understand that there's not going to be any peace until you
Right.
find justice for the Palestinians. And look
Right.
where we are.
Right, exactly. I
We
think,
had listened to Carter back then.
yeah, and I think getting back to this idea, was Carter a victim? I don't even want to call him victim, but he was naive. And he also, too, was brought up in an educational educational system, a media system, an entertainment system that defined and laid out what the world was like. And so the idea that even if you were to say, and I think Jimmy Carter, the Vietnam War posed to it, he would describe it as a mistake, right? So even when we have this now, right? Even we see it now, where it's this understanding that the excesses, the atrocities, the crimes of the empire, well, they are well intentioned. They were mistakes. We hear so often, 90% of the time, how do you hear the Iraq War described? A mistake. Remember Ken Burns' documentary that came down several years ago? I stopped watching it after 10 minutes because he starts off by saying how it was well intentioned. you know?
Yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, so I stopped watching at that point. Maybe I should have been more open-minded, but I mean, but so I think that was certainly my view of the U.S. I was a big history nerd and everything else, and but my view was that incredibly naive, stupid, if you want to call it that. That my generation was different, or that post Cold War, because I was a senior in high school when the Soviet Union is collapsing. When my freshman year in high school, December 90, my freshman year in college, excuse me, is December 91. The Soviet flag comes down at the Kremlin, right? So I was entering into adulthood as the world was changing. Same time too, the first Iraq War happens, right? And so those two events, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the first Iraq War, that is the clear transition to a new world order. And it's okay, whatever mistakes we have made in the past, it's different now. And there was bemoaning in the Marine Corps in the late 90s, and people took heart with the Balkans campaigns that maybe something might happen, or always the great hope that if you're in the Marines in the late 90s or in the mid 90s, late 90s, you always wanted to be on what we called a Westpac. So that was the Marine Expeditionary Unit, the three ships. If people who aren't familiar, the Marine Corps has troops, three battalions essentially, three battalions of infantry on ships around the world at any one time. You got a ship, you got we call it an ARG, an amphibious ready group. They may have changed the names. It's probably expeditionary readiness group now. They got one in the Pacific, they got one in the Persian Gulf region, and they got one in the Mediterranean. This is what they've essentially done more or less. And when I was a lieutenant, you wanted to be with 1st Marine Division, and you wanted to be on the MEU, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, that came out of San Diego and went to the Persian Gulf, because if anything was going to happen, that's where it was going to be, right? You didn't want, I mean, Mediterranean MEUs are great because you had all these ports to call. You're going to Italy, you're going to Greece, you're going to Turkey. It's great, it's like the brochure, the Marine Corps sells you. But if you're serious, you wanted to go to, but even so, like, it was going to be limited. That was the mindset in the Marine Corps, and like we were most likely going to do if we were to go back in time and talk to me as a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, junior captain before 9/11, it was I think it's primarily our missions are going to be humanitarian assistance and NEOs, non-combatant evacuation operations. So we're going to send Marines back into Liberia to take the embassy people out. I mean that was essentially the mindset. So again, was that silly? Was it naive? Was it cowardly? Certainly all those things, But that I think was the idea that post Cold War many of us had about how things were going to be different, and it allowed us to rationalize and apologize and excuse what had come before. And that somehow this great line of history, this continuous line of history that we're all a part of, was somehow broken. And this, of course, is very similar. I mean, certainly the idea being New World Order, Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, things like that. That was the mindset of many. Yeah.
Yeah. Carter also called us an oligarchy, said we'd lost our
Yeah.
democracy.
Yeah, and certainly Carter's democracy efforts, the Carter Center. I know a lot of people are very critical of it now. I don't think the president had much of a role in it these last many years because there have been criticisms. I think legitimate criticisms. They stepped State Department money. They are biased. They've fallen under the wing of the U.S. government essentially. That idea of clearly laying it out, and for
But
someone
one
who
of the first,
occupied the Oval Office. Right.
everyone at the Carter Center was, if not the first, one of the first to publicly call for a ceasefire.
Okay, yeah. I
3
know
weeks
that.
after October 7th.
Yeah. I'm familiar with some of the criticisms of their approach now towards elections, in the sense of providing their observers and essentially being kind of the criticisms being that they're quick to agree with the Western narrative as to whether an election was free and fair. So whether you're talking about elections, say like in Georgia or Romania, Venezuela, where I think you went back 15 years ago or so, if the Carter Center said, we think you could, I think, provide, there was some credibility to it. People may disagree. I think now the belief is that the Carter Center is going to go along with the conventional Western narrative of whether an election was free or fair, but certainly it had that role for a great time. Um, Calling out the United States as an oligarchy, a man who sat in the Oval Office. I don't think you get a more credible and authoritative, as well as too his what he and his rejection of that. He could have been like Barack Obama, hanging out with celebrities on Martha's Vineyard, right? He could have been George W. Bush, in a sense of going on the Ellen DeGeneres show and dancing and everything else. He could have had that type of celebrity. He could have had that wealth, that influence, and he chose to do it in a manner that was selfless in many ways, right? I mean, the idea
Yeah.
that you got this guy swinging his hammer, building homes for Habitat for Humanity, that's an iconic defining image. And like, I think, what he chose to do then, that rejection of both empire and oligarchy and the willingness to speak out as over whether it's American politics or international affairs, makes him a former president unlike any other. And God, can you
Well,
imagine if we had some generals and admirals who are willing to display Jimmy Carter's moral courage? I mean, this is an issue we have trying to get retired colonels, retired generals, admirals to speak out against American foreign policy that they know is ruinous, but they don't feel it's their place. They don't want to lose their invite to the cocktail parties. They're making $400,000 a year working for this defense contractor, and Jimmy Carter was the opposite of all that. And so I think, you've heard a lot of eulogies for Carter. And I think what you see that's a through line through in all those is this idea that the Carter's post presidency was way more important than his presidency. Because I think, again, the understanding is that, like, look, we didn't even get into other aspects, South Korea, Indonesia. I know you guys want to bring that up. Any other American president would have done the same thing. Any other American president would have told the South Korean dictator, yeah, go ahead. I'm releasing the South Korean troops to you because in Korea, the Korean army fell under the American army. So the American army had control of the South Korean military. And when there was uprisings in late 78, I think, or whatever it was, the Korean government had to ask the Americans to let us have our troops. And any other American president, let us have our troops so we can go out and shoot down the protesters in the street. I should be clear about that. Any other American government would have done the same, and the same with Indonesia invades East Timor. It's terrible. Hundreds of thousands are killed. That happens before Carter's president. But when they comes in, he doesn't do anything to stop it. He actually accelerates support for the Indonesian government. And from what I understand, the majority of people killed in East Timor are killed during Carter's presidency, right? I mean, but again, would any American president have done it? And I don't mean this to excuse or apologize for Carter, right? To wave it all off. But I think we have to have an understanding of the empire, right? We have to understand of the inertia of the inertia of it all. What else could have made a difference? And of course, those of us who I think you guys are probably in line with me, if you speak out against the empire, if you start doing things that the empire doesn't like, you end up with your head blown open in Dallas, like JFK, right? I mean, right? I mean, how much of that is true or not? There is an element, a degree of truth, I think, that we all understand at this point. So what, guys, I'm being charitable to Jimmy Carter. I obviously have a liking for him. Again, my understanding of him is all post-president. Anytime I saw Carter growing up, he was, sawing a board to build a house for some poor family in Mississippi or something like that, So I think it'd be tough for me to get past that bias, but I think we have to. I think the best way to look at Carter's presidency is as an imperial presidency in the span of post World War II, American foreign policy, American the American system, and of course that itself is totally connected to everything that occurs before World War II. That line exists before.
well, he wasn't supposed to be president anyway.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, and also true. And he wasn't popular within the Democratic Party.
No, you kidding me? I mean,
Yeah. I mean,
Ted Kennedy
yeah,
challenged him in the primary.
that's right. That's right. You know, and if,
Incumbent.
right. And, Kennedy, and also too, someone else challenged him as well. He had two major primary challengers. I can't remember who the other major
Yeah.
primary challenger. He had another pretty big primary challenger. Kennedy, of course, being Ted Kennedy. You
Hmm.
know,
Right.
and if well, of course, if Kennedy and all his personal things and Chappaquiddick, that
Hmm.
keeps him earlier. But he maybe you would have seen if Kennedy didn't have that baggage. It's quite possible that the sitting president would have lost in the primary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Possible. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So
I think my take, is along like yours. I think you have to understand that the president's power is not unlimited.
Right.
He's got people he has to answer to.
And
Besides,
he's got other priorities.
yeah,
And
right.
I'll say this, so my experience is that, you know, uh, I saw this in 2009. I saw this directly. At that point, I resigned from my position in Afghanistan. I was a media darling, and everything else all over the media. And and John Murtha, the late he died a month after this, but
wow,
a congressman from Pennsylvania had been in Vietnam, a Marine officer in the Vietnam War.
my
Yeah,
district.
yeah, okay, all right, yeah. Supposedly incredibly corrupt, but at least he was your guy. He may
Yeah,
be
you
corrupt, but
bet.
at least he's our guy, kind of thing. I think was kind of the way he handled it. But Murtha, one of the first, most prominent to go against the Iraq War. He had supported it, but he was one of the first to very publicly turn against it. And he was like that with Afghanistan. He wanted nothing to do with the escalation of the Afghan war. He wanted to get Afghanistan. To him, Afghanistan was the same as Iraq and Vietnam. And so anyway, with my resignation, my speaking out against it, he had me go in. He had me address the entire House Democratic Caucus. So this is November of 2009. One of those deals like, what the heck happened to me? I mean, how did I get here? So I'm in the basement of the Capitol building, one of these like large rooms they have down there, and it's surreal because I have experience in DC and I've been in the offices there and everything else, and I've been around it. But even I think just the idea that I'm addressing, it's not the idea I'm addressing them. It's the idea of like the way it was set up, where they're all sitting on folding chairs. In the back of the room is a buffet spread, and they're all back there like making sandwiches for themselves,
Ah.
And so it's like this kind of thing, like what the heck is going on here? Anyway, so Murtha and we go on about Afghanistan, and the Democrat and that caucus is excited. They are upset. There are like two microphones, just like any other thing you go to. There's two microphones set up in the aisle for them, and they're piled up 10, 12 deep right behind each microphone. This is you guys are absolutely right. This is another Iraq. We can't let the president get away with this. We can't allow blah, 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 blah. And this goes on for however long, 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then Speaker Pelosi pops up. And, speaker's privilege, she can talk. And she says, I understand what everyone's saying here. And I agree. However, we have
Yeah.
to remember what's the president's priority. And we cannot box him in on Afghanistan when his priority is the Affordable Care Act. Now, this was like on a Wednesday, just on the Friday before the House had passed a significant aspect of the ACA, of Obamacare, right? And so you see the prioritization of things, right? Yeah, I get that feeling from what I know about the deliberations in the Obama administration about escalating in Afghanistan, where it was the easier path. Like, we don't have the political capital to wage this. Our priority is the ACA. Also, too, we're in the midst of this great recession. Millions are losing their homes, right? So, okay, you know what? Why am I going to fight David Petraeus, who just last year went out, even though he lost the Iraq War, went out and we told him we won, but even though everyone knows we really lost that thing, he flipped the coin to start the Super Bowl last year, and everyone went nuts, right?
Uh,
You've got people in Congress who want to give Petraeus a fifth star. and you want to fight this guy on this kind of thing, right? Hillary Clinton is in love with the idea of escalating the Afghan war, right? I mean, she's your Secretary of State. And do you want her to run a primary challenge against you in 12? They wouldn't think Clinton wouldn't do that if she didn't think that was possible to do, right? I mean, like as well as we were saying before about Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel saying, "Mr. President, here's the poll numbers, and if you blah 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 blah," right? So I saw that firsthand, right? And what happens after the speaker says, as Speaker Pelosi says, "Look, we can't do this. It's just we don't have the political capital for it." I agree with you. Afghanistan's going to be a tragedy, just like Iraq, just like Vietnam. We can't win it, on and on and on. But the president's priority is the Affordable Care Act, is the economy, it's domestic. We have to let this go. And they did.
But
And
no one like Nancy Pelosi or in here. And when it was Carter, it was Tip O'Neill. He never did a thing for Carter.
right. The
He didn't
strength.
care what Carter priority.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember Tip O'Neill, because you heard that type of both resentment and reverence for him as a kid. People either hated him or they loved him.
Right.
But you saw that was the reality of it. And just to explain more about that, what occurs is the White House, the Democrats in Congress line up at the White House. Progressives, Barbara Lee, Jim McGovern, they're allowed to dissent, right? Murtha dies in December, by the way. He has a complication of a surgery. Murtha dies a month later, right? So that kind of takes the leadership of that movement, particularly leadership like Murtha, out of that type of anti-war movement. But if you're Barbara Lee, if you're Jim McGovern, you can dissent just in the same way the Republicans. Hey, Ron Paul, you want to go crazy about these wars? There's space for you to do that, But they coalesce around the White House. And then what the White House does, if people remember, when Barack Obama has his big speech at West Point in December of '09, finalizing the escalation of the Afghan war. Just to set the context, when Obama came into office a year before, there were 30,000 American troops in Afghanistan, about 30,000 contractors, and about 15 or 20,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. By the time Obama makes his December of '09 speech, that 30,000 American troops is now 40,000, and he adds 30,000 onto that. So by the summer of 2010, you go to 100,000 American troops, 100,000 contractors, and 40,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan. So you go from roughly 70 or 80,000 foreign troops in Afghanistan at the beginning of '09 to a year and a half later, a 250,000 man Western army in Afghanistan. It's massive, right? We forget all this. We don't even talk about it anymore. But what Obama and the White House does very smartly is they say, but by summer of 2011, we're going to start pulling troops out. And what he does what occurs is that they slowly release Democrats to speak against the war. And you'd see that, because I was up there. This is the work I was doing. I was in Capitol Hill all the time arguing against the war, going to conferences and sitting on panels and all that, right? And then also, too, I keep seeing I'm getting more and more appearances on MSNBC. Right. That's on CNN too. And, it was part of the strategy by the Obama administration to show that we're going to win this war, right? Give Petraeus and Clinton and all those people what they want, and then get out before the 2012 election so that the Afghan war is not an issue in 2012, which it wasn't, even though by 2012, 70% of Americans are against the Afghan war, whatever the number was. It's not an election issue because the United States is pulling out of Afghanistan. Right. Yeah, I mean, so it was very brilliant, very smartly done. It gets upended by the Islamic State in Iraq. I really do think by 2015, the United States would have been out of Afghanistan under Obama. But what happens is the Islamic State it takes Mosul and takes almost all of Western and Northern Iraq. And again, Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod, I don't think Emanuel was still there at that time, but his political people would have come in and said, Mr. President, you can't keep drawing down troops in Afghanistan. They're already saying you pulling the troops out of Iraq is why the Islamic State has taken control of Iraq because of your weakness. If you do the same in Afghanistan, so you see that halt. And then he leaves it up to Trump and Trump, of course, leaves it up to Biden. And Biden, to his credit, does finally get the Americans out of Afghanistan 21. But you see the political maneuvering, the idea of how much political capital they have, the prioritization, and the willingness of the president to not want to fight that imperial inertia. Let alone the entire foreign policy consensus, the people who are occupying all those posts have that imperial mindset. And so Carter would have had the same type of issues he was up against.
So was Carter just not willing, or maybe not smart enough, to deal with the politics to get himself reelected?
I don't know how much of the foreign policy had an issue in his reelection. I think it was a lot of the perception of him. Certainly, the Republicans painted him as weak, as we discussed earlier, right? Even the fact that he massively increased the defense budget, made sure all these weapons were in production. I think you look at the economics of the time, the stagflation. Carter gives his malaise speech, which I mean,
it was common sense. We didn't like to hear it.
Yeah, yeah, but you can't. I mean, for the man sitting in the Oval Office is to criticize the American people that way might not be the best political maneuver, kind of thing. Certainly, and that feeds right into like, oh, we're malaise, and then Reagan runs. It's morning again in America, right? If you look at Reagan's campaign, I mean, say you will got the guy. Objectively, politically, it's I don't want to say brilliant, but a very, very well done campaign, right? So Carter's saying everything sucks. You guys are, right? And then you got Reagan being, it's morning again in America, people, like that type of thing. So, that is grossly oversimplified, the 1980 elections. But, I think there was that kind of idea there that really hampered Jimmy Carter. The idea too that he was out of his depth, that he was out of he was a peanut farmer, which may have helped him, right, in terms of his rise of like, hey, this guy's a common man. But not only he was a Navy officer, but he's a common man. He's out there like, and that became like he doesn't know what he's doing. He's out of his depth, right?
Yeah. When he sent in that rescue mission,
yes,
that failed drastically. That's when my wife and I just, no, we can't do it. And so we didn't vote for Reagan, but because you'd see through him if you were watching. But we voted for John Anderson, a third party.
I remember going into the ballot box with my dad, behind the curtains and everything, and seeing that. And so I would have been 7 years old. And been like, and Carter, Reagan, my dad voted for Reagan, of course. Carter, Reagan, and Anderson. I never heard of this Anderson guy. Who's he? And I remember my dad says, like, don't worry about him. He's like a nobody, And so for people who know me, who involved in independent politics, third party politics, that was my upbringing, So, but I think there was, I'll leave it at that. Yeah. But
you can tell that Carter had the instincts of a preacher, not a politician.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's, you've heard this. Supposedly that's a famous Obama saying that Obama says to people, you can either be a prophet or a king, but not both. So you can either remain pure to your principles or you can be practical. My response to that was always like, did you see what happened to the kings who disagreed with them, who didn't listen to the prophet? Have you read the Old Testament? Like, it doesn't work out well for any of them.
No, but they keep getting elected.
It's and it's the people that suffer, right? I mean, if you want to get into that vein, right? It's the people in the Old Testament. It's the Hebrews who keep suffering. They keep getting put into exile and everything else, right? I mean, so because the kings are corrupt. The kings lose sight of their purpose. The kings, defy God essentially, right? And
Right.
But more important, that's too much. It's the idea of not serving the people, and yeah.
Well, I think the two things I would point to if somebody wanted to talk about it in the wake of this funeral was there are two things happening that if we listened to Carter might not be happening. One is the genocide and the other is the fire in LA. It's gonna get worse.
Right.
Fire in LA and hurricane in North Carolina.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, just the whole, I just saw that and people debate about the meaning of it. But last year, because you're supposed to have like a 5 year view of it. But last year, 2024, the world broke 1.5 degree
Yeah, right.
Celsius increase that
Right.
Paris in 2015, the Paris Accords in 2015 were supposed to prevent from ever happening.
That's
And
the
we
Yep.
did
same.
that in like
Right.
8 years.
Yeah.
I think people who followed, of course, know Paris was always a joke. Paris was always just a political stunt. It was never going to do anything. But certainly, yeah, Jimmy Carter, most famously, right? He puts the solar panels on top of the White House.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He lowered the speed limit to
He
55
lowered the
miles
speed
an
limit.
hour. You
Yeah.
remember that? I mean,
I
that's
don't
not a way to be
remember
popular.
Matt wasn't
as
driving.
Yeah, as a kid, I don't. I'm sure though, if I had listened to my dad and my dad was a firefighter. If I had
Yeah.
gone down to the fire station, and listened to those guys,
Yeah.
right, they probably were bitching about that, So
So,
But,
I was telling Harvey earlier that when Carter put solar panels on the White House, my wife and I actually found a little solar company and invested in them. And it didn't work out
yeah,
because Reagan came along and, the company went out of business. We lost our money, da 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 da.
right,
But, we were all behind him with what he was planning to do. And the Malay speech didn't work out. But I was thinking, he's just talking common sense.
right, yeah.
We just need to look around and say,
but
yeah, we're over
he
consuming.
never said the word
That's
malaise.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Got labeled that
That was
way.
the
Yeah,
press.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and the thing about it too is the complexity of it. So we talk about the image of the solar panels and what that meant. At the same time too, we discussed the Carter Doctrine, and what was the purpose of the Carter Doctrine? The
Yeah.
purpose of the Carter Doctrine, we should have gone over this, was to ensure there would not be an oil shock as there was, an economic shock as there was,
Early
with
70s.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
To ensure the continuous supply of fossil fuels. At that point, I guess it was primary oil. I don't think gas. It
Mhm.
certainly wasn't LNG at that point, but
Mhm.
the continuous supply of fossil fuels, oil, out of the Persian Gulf that would not cause havoc to the world economy. And again, if you call him Emperor Carter rather than President Carter, that makes incredible sense what he did,
And
right?
OPEC could blackmail us.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah. And we still maintain that. We still,
Yeah.
the United States for decades has gotten very, 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 very little oil and gas from the Middle East. I mean, and we are the world's largest producer of oil and gas in the world. We set records in the last 5, 6 years. We have set records for both oil and gas production, world records. Yeah, every year we keep beating it, right? And I think that's supposed to stop for natural gas. But the why is it still important? Then why are we policing the Persian Gulf? Why is the Carter Doctrine still in place? Well, it's because of the effect that would have on the world economy, right? And
Right.
of course, we would have that would be there would be a downstream, right? We would suffer because of that, the United States. One, because for lots of reasons people can understand. But then again, look in the perspective of the obligation of the empire, the obligation to ensure the entire world is running smoothly because that's how the empire benefits. The West, you use another phrase from the empire, but like the West, the extraction of wealth from the global South, from the developing world, you can't have anything disturbing that, which is one of the reasons why we're so upset about China, right? Because China's trying to muscle in on our good thing, right? The Chinese we're the ones who get to extract wealth from the poor countries, not the Chinese. Who are
Right.
they to think, right? And so one of the reasons why the United States is so upset with China. But yeah, I mean, that's part of it is that we have to maintain not just for our interests as an empire, but for our imperial, for our provincial interests, for our vassals' interests, right? Europe's economic health is important to the United States, right? It's important to the empire. It's even better though if we can sell them the LNG rather than pipeline gas from Russia. Absolutely, of course. And if that means we have to destroy Ukraine in the process, or along with, I shouldn't say we, but along with the Russians destroy Ukraine in the process,
Yep.
then so be it. You know.
Yeah, and I guess we shouldn't mention pipelines. Would in the same context as Russia and Ukraine and whatever, because that is the jury still out as far as whether we destroyed that pipeline?
I don't know anyone who's with an ounce of integrity who's going to think otherwise at this point. I mean, you just had a few months ago, you had that Danish port captain or whatever they call them, who was like, yeah, no, there are American ships out there without their transponders on and they refuse to communicate with us and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and just the way the Swedes and the Germans have
Mhm.
all handled their, and the Danes have handled their investigations. I mean, if you put it in, if this is a local police department, say something happened, someone was murdered, and a local police department handled the investigation of the murder the way that the Swedes, the Germans, the Danes have handled these official investigations. No kidding, it's a cover up. You know, I mean, of course, it's a cover up. The dead
Right.
body lying right there. You know, you're saying nothing happened. You know, what I mean, like,
Mhm.
so yeah, no, I think it's quite clear. And you see, you know, this is one of the things that the great horrors of the Ukraine war, of which there are many. But I think one that people get wrong is people say there are no victors in Ukraine, and I don't agree that's true. I mean, American fossil fuel companies and the Qatari
Yeah.
LNG companies, massive, massive victors in Ukraine. Russia had at one point 40% of the gas market in Europe. They now have almost zero now, and that particularly since that pipeline through Ukraine. If people weren't familiar, even as they're going on 3 years of Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine, there's a pipeline that has pumped natural gas from Russia through Ukraine to countries like Hungary and Slovakia. So even as this war is going on, even as they're killing and wounding and destroying and all that suffering, money's still being made. You know, it's an
Mhm.
incredible dirty war. But
Ugh.
what you have is you have the destruction of the Russian gas presence in Europe. And that, of course, filled by American and Qatari LNG companies. This allows the United States to become the biggest gas producer in the world. And this is too, I mean, you have to understand the evolution of all this, where how did we go from September or October 2012 in the presidential debates, uh, Barack Obama mocking Mitt Romney for saying that Russia is the principal adversary of the United States, to 6 months later or so, an escalation of great tension between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine, or just Russia and the U.S. in general, to the coup, of course, then in Ukraine in 14, you know, and then the war in the Donbass, you know, on and on. Well, you look what happens. You have fracking in the U.S. And what are you going to do? Where's that gas going to go? Right. And at the same time, too, what you have happening in 2012, 2013, you go back and look, you start seeing these gas companies, these energy companies start submitting permits to the Department of Energy and whoever else they have to submit permits to for the construction of either new gas terminals or expansion of existing gas terminals. Because you're fracking all this gas, where's it going to go? Where's the market? And Europe was a prized market. Now, actually, the demand in Europe is coming down as the renewables come online and everything else. Gas demand is lowering, but that's certainly, you know, an aspect of that. And you know, so okay, we could talk about that, and then all right, but isn't that whole energy policy what defined the Carter Doctrine, or one of the main reasons for the Carter Doctrine? And so you see these same through lines throughout these presidencies, the pressures. I think Barack Obama in 2012 really did believe what he said to Mitt Romney, that you're an idiot, Mitt. The Cold War's calling. You know, you should not be president. You know, you're so far out of touch. I think you really, because remember too, the first Obama administration was about resetting relations with Russia and everything else. And I really do think, I really do think, but what's he gonna do? Fight the, you know, everything else. So, yeah, I think we see these through lines, these consistencies in these presidents that make us understand better why this is an empire, why these are imperial presidencies, why calling them emperors, while people roll their eyes and say, "What the hell are you talking about?" If you put Emperor Obama in front of his,
Mhm.
you know, rather than President Obama, Emperor Carter, Emperor Trump, God help us. You know, it's right. I mean, and Trump is a great example, right? I mean, Emperor
Mhm.
Trump says he wants to take Greenland. He says he wants to invade. Makes total sense. Oh, the emperor wants to do that. Of course, the emperor wants to do it. That's the empires do. You
Mhm.
know, you say president. Oh no, he's a constitutional republic, a democratic republic. Why would he do that? He's the president. And you change the
Mhm.
title, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, no, I could see why why he do that.
So sounds like another show. But Matt, we've kept you here for an hour and a half. And so is there anything you wanted to say about Jimmy Carter that you didn't get a chance to say?
No, I mean, I think you look at him. I think a lot of us, I think a lot of us envious. The guy was married to one person for 77 years. I mean, things like that. You look at his life. Up until however recently, he was still swinging that hammer with Habitat for Humanity.
Yeah,
I mean, just like the character of the man, right? I think is something that again that we critiqued him with all kinds of blemishes and warts, and yeah, you could crimes certainly aiding the Indonesians in their destruction of East Timor was a great crime. I mean, and there's no sugarcoating it. There's no rationalizing it. There's no put it away. But try and understand the man as a whole, particularly in his turn from that. Again, he could have left office and gone to work for General Motors, right? He could have done he was a young man at the time, still relatively. He could have done a million different things. You don't think there was a role for him then in the Clinton administration if he had played ball? He could have been the whatever U.S. ambassador to the world, to the UN, or he could have been anything, and this is what he chose to do. And again, the great courage he displayed, particularly accurately defining Israel's occupation and subjugation of the Palestinians as apartheid. And certainly, we didn't talk about South Africa and how disappointing, looking back, Carter was on South Africa. Disappointing might be too polite of a word for that. But yeah, I mean, so I think the takeaway is the complexity of him, his role as an imperial president, how he did well in that as an imperial president, as an emperor, but then too his renunciation of it and his distancing himself and his ability to do better. And I think as veterans for peace, those of us who served the empire, who were part of the military machine, who went to war, who took part in the destruction, the killing of whole societies, that's what we do. And so, if we can't look at Jimmy Carter and find some reflection of ourselves in him, I don't know if it's possible for us to do it in any way. And so, I think that's also too why I'm so charitable to Carter is because who am I? Who am I to cast a stone? Right? The same things, all the great things I just said, all the anti-imperial, pro-peace stuff I just spewed for the last hour and a half. What's it really matter to what I did in Iraq, right, where I was carrying a
right.
rifle? So I depend upon people's forgiveness. I depend on people's charity, their understanding that things are complex and people evolve, people change, right? So I want to bestow the same thing to President Carter, right? So again, who am I to cast the first stone?
Excellent. What a way to finish up.